You may or may not know that Italy was an Allied power in the First World War, and it's pretty well known that Italy was an Axis power in the Second. But what happened in between? Today we're going to find out how Italy bumped its head and forgot who it was. And in advance, no, it wasn't all Mussolini. But he did have a salient role. Actually, what we're talking about had a huge impression on history, and it's a shame that not too many people talk about it. This transformation of Italy is very much a good suspect for starting World War II. So let's try getting through this without using any Italian stereotypes. Yeah. The base for the change of Italy came in World War I and its results. Before Italy joined the war, both sides made numerous offerings to Italy to either stay neutral or join their side, and Italy came pretty close to joining the Germans in April 1915. But when Italy joined the Allies, they shed not a pond, nor lake, but a sea of blood during the war. And after the armistice, and when the Treaty of Versailles was being made, the Italian delegation was treated very disrespectfully, and this foreshadowed the terms of the treaty for Italy. They were promised much more land than they were actually given, and all of this greatly upset the Italians. After almost 2/3 of a million died, we don't even get what we were promised. Not only were the people infuriated, but even worse after war, the treasury was close to empty. A nation cannot live in these conditions, and it won't. During war, ideas manifested in many people's heads, including Benito Mussolini's. Since 1915, Italy's quality of life and economy fell, and in the last year of war, Mussolini argued that dictatorship could fix the nation's issues. Many people today don't know why absolutism was ever popular, so in short, democracies can have internal divides about whether or not to do something, but with the one person, decisions are made quickly. But in mid-1918, he gave hints how he should be this man, and in March next year, he formed the Fasci di Combattimento, a political and police force. He drove people to him by using dramatic speeches with nonsensical statements, but similar groups also came out. The goals of such groups was to take over the government and stop liberal domination of politics. They plagued the land, beat up suspected enemies, and ruined stuff, and essentially set local governments. All of these groups were impossible to govern, and parties also were troublesome, but only for people like Mussolini. Mussolini wanted to enter the government, but he simply wasn't popular enough. So in 1921, he joined the national blocs. Think of the US or EU, but with right-wing groups instead of states. This teamwork got the blocs near 20% of seats in the Chamber of Deputies after the 1921 election. Now with more political power, he is able to round many terror groups around him and control large parts of the peninsula by the end of the year. Also by this time, the government was doing nothing as the mainly middle-class chamber wanted to weed out all socialists and was still very poor. Mussolini kept giving his romantic speeches, and he drew ever more people to his cause. Everything was ready for revolution. When socialists called for a general strike in the 1922 summer, Mussolini gave 2 days for the government to put it down, otherwise his fascists would. This would demonstrate that the government had lost control, and Mussolini should take control. The government did all they could, but they needed the help of the fascists. After, in October, Mussolini declared either the government will be given to us, or we will seize it by marching on Rome, with over 1 million followers. 4 days later, on the 28th, they marched on Rome, and ultimately as a result of this, Mussolini became El Duce, the leader. Over the following years, he would implement his policies. The GDP would steadily increase, and by the end of 1923, his followers made the majority of parliament. Benito had proven himself. Benito Mussolini rebuilt his nation from ashes. He did this via his economic battles, which began after the 1924 general election. The battle for grain began in 1925 to stop food imports by outlawing growth of most things except mainly grain. And by the late 30s, the goal was met, but they still had to import other non-food items. The battle for the lira in 1926 immediately made imports much cheaper than stuff made in the country by revaluing the currency at a higher price. The battle for births in 1927 set the standard of 12 kids per family, taxed bachelors, lowered the marriage age, gave loans to couples, and taxes were lowered for each child born. And the battle for land in 1928 made it hard to move to cities and dried many marshlands for farms by 1942. The new nation Il Duce had created would go on to take part in the tragedy known as World War II.